important field, given that the problem of perception is the problem that has bedeviled both the sciences and the humanities, and also engineering, for that matter, for the last 50 years. And it has not only done that, it's produced this riveting of culture that's occurred within the universities, partly because of the postmodernist claim. And so, fundamental postmodernist claims. Now, the first claim is that there's no canonical interpretation that's self-evident. It's like, okay, fair enough. That might be a claim emerging from literary departments, English literary departments, under the influence of French continental thought, let's say. I don't think you can take issue with that. I think it happens to be the case, because the notion that there is a multiplicity of potentially valid interpretations is true. What isn't true is the idea that we use power and domination to solve that problem primarily. And there's no excuse, philosophically, from leaping from a mystery that's utterly profound, which is the problem of perception, to the conclusion that some pathological, socially constructed process is therefore at the basis of the act of perception and categorization itself. I think it's unforgivable cognitively, and it's cynical beyond belief, and it's corrosive beyond our capacity to deal with it. I mean, you think about what that claim means, is that the way you solve and that's like an implicit bias argument, by the way, just to make that clear as well, that you solve the problem of categorization by imposing your will to power on the world in some zero-sum, winner-take-all game of dominion and oppression. It's like, you could not, if you tried, you could not come up with a more cynical view of the mechanism that makes order, habitable order, out of chaos. But what's sort of delightful about that, in some sense, is that it's just not true. It's literally. We could say scientifically, if we take scientifically to mean literally, we can say it's not true. It actually turns out that even in the animal kingdom, you might think the hierarchies that we use to orient ourselves in, that's part of the strategy that we use to guarantee our survival. We fight tooth and nail with nature red and claw to climb the hierarchies of dominance as a consequence of our will to power. It's like, no, actually, that isn't how it works. And so we all have this image, or many of us, I would say, have an image of chimpanzee troops, let's say, our closest primate relative. We split from them in evolutionary terms about 7 million years ago, something like that. You can calculate that quite accurately by looking at the mutation rate of genetic material that we share with chimps, and calculate the average mutation rate and look at the propagation of mutations and the separation of them. You can get a pretty accurate estimate of the split. It's a long time ago. So we're pretty tightly related to chimpanzees. And we all know that the biggest, toughest, meanest, male, oppressive chimp rules the troop. It's like, no, wrong. Franz de Waal has studied dominance hierarchies, so-called dominance hierarchies, and that's an interesting issue, that is the term that's most often used, dominance hierarchy, because you might ask, as a very intelligent student of mine once did, just exactly where did that term come from? And how much political implication was loaded in that right from the beginning? I thought about that for about 5 years. I thought it was I thought it was an unbelievably acute observation. He was is a very acute fellow. So the brute chimpanzees, they have a pretty short tyrannical rule. And the reason for that is, I don't care how big and tough and mean and dominant and oppressive you are, 2 slightly less mean, oppressive, and dominant males can take you out pretty easily on a bad day. And that's a real problem. You think about that biologically. That's a non-trivial problem. And so that is exactly what happens in chimpanzee troops, is that the males who rise to a position of authority as a mere consequence of their psychopathic will to power rule very unstably over very unstable troops and have a very short ruling period. Whereas the males that manage to, because in chimps, the fundamental hierarchy is male-dominated. It's less obvious in another set of very close primate relatives, the bonobos. They're more female-dominated, interestingly enough, and it isn't obvious which of those two species were more like. But I'll concentrate on the chimps now because we're talking a little bit about will to power. The males who manage to maintain a relatively stable coalition, let's say, are actually very affiliative. In fact, they groom other males more than any other males in the troop. And so they're using reciprocal altruism, at least in part, as the basis of their claim to dominion. Now, they do have preferential mating access to females. And that there's some analogy in that with what happens in the human case, but it's more complicated in the human case. In any case, they also tend to spend a fair bit of time attending to the females in the troop in a positive way and to their infants. And so the more benevolent, but still physically able males seem to establish a stable social hierarchy that's quite unlike the social hierarchy that's produced by the, more psychopathic, straight, raw will to power. And here's another fact for what it's worth. If the hierarchy that we use to aggregate the canon is fundamentally predicated on oppressive power, which is the claim, then why do psychopaths only constitute 3% of the population? And that's actually stable. And so there are good evolutionary psychology models of psychopathy. Its emergence has been modeled emergence and stability has been modeled quite nicely in computer simulations, and such simulations can be used as appropriate models. If the psychopath prevalence falls below 1%, there's so few of them that people get complacent in relationship to the possibility of malevolence. And so then they can flourish a bit, right? And their prevalence can rise in the population. But if it gets up to 5%, it's like everybody wakes up, and it's not such a good day for the psychopaths when they do. And and somebody has to keep the malevolent types down, and that's possibly, we'll say, why women like men who are less agreeable than they are. And women have to solve this very complex mating problem in relationship to men, which is, there are bad men. They're really bad. And they're a minority of the population. And they tear their way through overly agreeable populations. And to keep them from dominating, you need good men who are also capable of being quite terrible. And so that appears to be the conundrum that women face when they're choosing male partners, one of the conundrums. They want someone who's strong enough to resist what's truly terrible, but benevolent and generous enough and productive enough to be productive and useful, but also agreeable and empathic enough to share. And you can see that that's a terribly tight line, right? And women are always, young women tend to overshoot the mark on the malevolent side. So the psychopathic Machiavellians who mimic competent male behavior, they ape it, so to speak, are differentially attractive to young and inexperienced women. Whereas the women who've had some experience get better at distinguishing the psychopathic Machiavellian pretenders who often manifest a certain confidence and a certain bravado. They get good at distinguishing them from the real thing. And so it's a tricky thing for women to manage, and men can use deceptive strategies to mimic competence, which is exactly what deceptive strategies are for, obviously. And that's also a pathway to short-term mating success under some circumstances. And it's viable enough to propagate itself in the population, but it's not a good medium to long-term strategy. And the question might be, what is a good medium to long-term strategy? And it looks like something, that is the question that's actually at the bottom of this entire talk, because it's also the same question as, what is the process that gives rise to perception itself? This is an attempt to integrate across a whole variety of complex questions. So, You might ask yourself, this is where it gets difficult to tie all these things together. So let me see how I'm going to be able to do this. Yes, there's no evidence, as far as I can tell, that the proposition that the fundamental motivation for categorization itself is the expression of power. That seems wrong. It's not stable. So then the question is, well, what is exactly at the base of the process of perception and categorization? And so that would be really right at the basis of cognition itself, perhaps the essence of consciousness itself, and certainly the thing that acts at the interface between what is not yet known and what is going to be known, right? The active investigation that transforms what's unexpected and potentially dangerous into what's habitable, safe, competent, and secure. I saw this opera. I bet you didn't think I was going there. I saw this opera in New York City about 3 weeks ago. Opera written by a dead white male of the oppressive sort, Wagner. And so he's way up there on that list, man. And it was the opera Die Meistersinger. And it was really interesting. The libretto was really interesting. It really dovetailed in a strange way with the sorts of things I happened to be writing about at that point. And I'll just run through it quickly, and hopefully that will help tie together these strands that I've laid all over the place now. So while music does that, right, it ties things together. And great art does that, it ties things together. And it's part of the process by which we make order out of chaos, right? Great art, not power, great art. And you have to be so cynical that it beggars description and so envious of what's great to reflexively identify that with the will to power. I mean, really? That's what you think when you enter one of the great cathedrals or chapels that grace your campus? You think nothing but will to power erected that? Corrupt oppression? And if you do think that, well, what do you think of yourself then? You think you're nothing but the expression of the corrupt will to power? Or you somehow circumvented that because of your moral piety? And, well, in that case, then what is it you're relying on to orient yourself in the world? Is something other than that will to power? Well, if so, then exactly what it is. What is it? Well, you come to university to ally yourself with the forces of great art, let's say. And that's so much more powerful than mere power that they're not even in the same category.